The 20th century. Rand, Hayek, Nozick, Rothbard, and Rawls. All good things, even this history, must come to an end. But the question is where? Our ruminations so far have brought us into the 20th century in its consideration of war and the emergence of the new tribalisms. It is tempting, and not only for reasons of exhaustion, to leave matters there, but there are some individual 20th century philosophers who simply cannot be ignored. So in this final section, I give a brief account of 5 20th century thinkers who are important figures in the history of political thought from the perspective of liberty. Ayn Rand, Friedrich Hayek, Robert Nozick, Murray Rothbard, and John Rawls. There are many more thinkers who might well merit inclusion in a history such as this, but if this series is ever to finish, a line, however arbitrary, must be drawn somewhere, and I draw it here. So, who is Ayn Rand? If you were to ask this question of a random, reasonably educated, politically literate person, you've got a pretty good chance of getting an answer. In terms of public recognition, readership and following, Rand wins hands down over Friedrich Hayek, John Rawls, Robert Nozick, and even over Murray Rothbard. In 2007, her novel Atlas Shrugged sold almost 200,000 copies, and that was just in 1 year. I suspect that this yearly total probably exceeds the combined lifetime sales of Hayek, Rawls, Nozick, and Rothbard. The great disparity in sales tells us nothing, of course, of the relative intellectual worth of these authors' productions, but it is evidence of their reach and influence. Whatever one thinks of Rand's work, and however much she may be despised and ignored by academia, the great unwashed have taken her to their heart. For a woman who has been dead for over 30 years, and who during her lifetime and after was in receipt of more than her fair share of obloquy, she is perhaps more influential today than she has ever been. Why? Douglas Rasmussen thinks she is newsworthy for a variety of reasons, all of them substantive, including her ability to note with dramatic force the immorality and hypocrisy of our current political age, her commitment to individual rights, her holding liberty and capitalism inviolate, her rejection of moral cannibalism in any form, her advocacy of moral individuals, her recognition of a moral order grounded in human nature, and her realization that reality is not only intelligible but open to the possibilities for human achievement, far more wondrous than ever realized. Well, perhaps so. These are all good reasons for her to attract attention. But this wouldn't explain why thinkers who have proposed much the same ideals are not sought out by the general public with the same fervour as she is. Neera Badwar agrees with Rasmussen's account of why Rand is in the news, but she adds that she, that is Rand, would not be any more in the news than Mises, Hayek, or Bastiat if she had not expressed these ideas in fiction, especially Atlas Shrugged. Her fiction appeals not only to our reasoning capacities, but also to our imaginative and emotional capacities. Michael Huemer is of the same mind as Badwar, remarking that the reason Rand is making the headlines while other liberty-promoting thinkers are not is that Rand is the most compelling writer of the group. More importantly, Rand was not only a philosopher, but a compelling novelist. Of course, Rand is not the first philosopher to have achieved renown largely through the medium of novels. Rousseau, too, owed most of his fame, not to his treatises, but to his novels La Nouvelle Héloïse and Émile. I believe that Badwar and Huemer are right in thinking that Rand's fiction is the key to her widespread popularity. For every person who is widely excited by abstract philosophical ideas, there are thousands whose imaginations are fired and intellect captivated by the stirring depiction of the human drama. Many people have come to a love of liberty through the reading of Rand's novels. Even though her non-fiction writing is strong and characterful, her fiction outsells her non-fiction by several orders of magnitude. Huemer notes, the lesson for defenders of freedom seems clear. We need more novelists, screenwriters, and other artists. Man may not live by bread alone, but reason alone rarely moves us to action. It should be said that not everyone is as enthusiastic about Rand's writing as Badwar and Huemer. Anthony Flew remarks that it is unfortunate that Rand's novels are so full of long philosophical speeches, and that her contributions to philosophy are so largely a matter of quoting the speeches from her novels. Her moral ideas could have been much better illustrated with the help of detailed accounts of paradigm lives, both good and bad, and developed in contrast or relation with certain classical philosophers. I have to confess that I am sympathetic to Flew's point of view. I have no taste for didactic fiction, and I have found it practically impossible to read Rand's novels all the way through, with the exception of Anthem, despite having tried to do so repeatedly. Rand's fans, please don't hate me. I've bought Atlas Shrugged 3 times, contributing my little bit to the high sales figures, and on each occasion have failed to finish it, although in my 3 attempts I think I've read most of it. On the other hand, I find Rand's non-fiction essays delightful, short, incisive, and vigorous. So, what is it then that keeps Rand in the public eye? Is it her ideas? Is it her novels? Well, I believe it's both. Rand's ideas are not that terribly different in many respects from that which can be found elsewhere, even if her organization and presentation of them is novel. And didactic fiction was invented long before Rand started writing. What is unique in Rand is the combination of her ideas about freedom and individuality embodied in a fictional setting that many people find imaginatively gripping and intellectually satisfying. Her ideas are a combination of classical and modern themes. Her basic philosophical orientation is Aristotelian, though just how much Aristotle she actually read is a moot point. In fact, it's quite hard to determine just how much of any philosopher Rand ever read. She portrays Kant as the great Satan, but this depiction of Kant is hard to reconcile with the writings of the mild-mannered man from Königsberg. Rand manages to update Aristotle without losing what is essential to him. She is a metaphysical and epistemological realist, as is Aristotle, but she abandons Aristotle's polis-based account of politics for a liberal conception of politics centered on freedom. She attempts to combine an essentially classical or pre-modern view of man with a modern political doctrine. The argument is that freedom of action in society is a function of what is proper to living a good human life. When she depicts virtue as constitutive of what it is to lead a good life, she is channeling Aristotle. From her classical heritage also comes the idea that self-interest properly understood and morality properly understood cannot genuinely conflict. Nor could the self-interest of one person genuinely conflict with the self-interest of another, provided that self-interest is properly understood. These ideas may seem strange to us today, but as Roderick Long notes, they were commonplaces of the classical tradition. Long also notes the diverse sources of Rand's philosophical inspiration, remarking that she sets out to found a classical liberal conception of politics, including strong individual rights to negative liberty, upon a classical Greek conception of human nature and the human good. He goes on to note, however, that she adds to her ethics a spirit of heroic exaltation drawn from Nietzsche and the French Romantics. Her Aristotelianism and liberalism enter into an uneasy alliance with a strain of ethical egoism coming from Nietzsche and Stirner, though once again it's not easy to tell just how much of either man she read. There appears to be an unresolved strain in Rand's work between her ideal human being as the Aristotelian great-souled man, Megalopsuchus, or as the Nietzschean Übermensch or the Stirnerite egoist. If freedom and the individual are characteristic themes in Rand's thought, another central notion is the associated idea of rights. For Rand, rights are not entitlements to things, but rather the freedom to act. Even property rights are not conceived by her to be rights to things, but only the freedom to pursue courses of action with respect to material goods. Rand's society is composed of individuals who each have rights to life, liberty, and property, which each must respect. Rights for Rand are essentially negative, putting others under an obligation not to interfere with one another, not claim rights that oblige others positively to do things for others. The basic human right can be framed positively as a right to take whatever actions are necessary for sustaining a human life. Rights for Rand are natural, covalent with man's rational nature, and not something conferred either by society or by the government. Michael Huemer is one of those who sees a fundamental tension between Rand's egoistic ethics and the remainder of her work. If Huemer is right about this tension would appear to be an instance of the unresolved strain I just mentioned between Rand's Aristotelian and classical liberal heritage on the one hand, and her spirit of heroic exaltation, which I believe derives, albeit in a diluted form, from Nietzsche and Stirner. Rand claims that every person is an end in himself. This idea, while arguable, is not novel. Even Rand's intellectual nemesis, Immanuel Kant, held this position. There is, however, a possible ambiguity in this claim. I can regard myself as an end in myself, indeed it is hard to see how I could not do so, and then either regard others merely as means to my ends, or regard them as ends in themselves. The former alternative is compatible with ethical egoism. The latter alternative is not. Huemer remarks that regarding others merely as means to my ends would make a defence of individual rights obscure, while regarding others as ends in themselves could not be advanced by a true egoist, who must hold that it is obligatory to treat other persons and everything else as mere means to one's own welfare. Rand doesn't often direct detailed critical attention to the work of other thinkers. When she does, however, the combination of her intellectual penetration and literary dexterity can be devastating. Her critique of some of the core contentions of Rawls' A Theory of Justice is priceless. If you are reasonably familiar with the thrust of Rawls' work, read on. If not, perhaps come back to this section when you've read the treatment of Rawls below. Rawls accepts that it is a natural fact that some people are born in one way and others in other ways. This is just a brute fact of nature. It is neither just nor unjust, the notion of justice having no application here. However, Rawls does think that whatever the initial distribution of gifts and talents and abilities may be, they are to be put to use for the benefit of all, especially the least advantaged. How does this follow? Rand remarks, if a natural fact is neither just nor unjust, by what mental leap does it become a moral problem and an issue of justice? Rand's attack on the whole idea of a lottery of individual gifts and talents is masterly. She describes it as a kind of fairy tale, the notion that man before birth is some sort of indeterminate thing, an entity without identity, something like a shapeless chunk of human clay, and that fairy godmothers proceed to grant or deny him various attributes, favours, intelligence, talent, beauty, rich parents, and so on. These attributes are handed out arbitrarily. This word is preposterously inapplicable to the processes of nature. It is a lottery among pre-embryonic non-entities, and, supposedly, adult mentalities conclude, since a winner could not possibly have deserved his good fortune, a man does not deserve or earn anything after birth as a human being because he acts by means of undeserved, unmerited, unearned attributes. Implication. To earn something means to choose and earn your personal attributes before you exist. In connection with Rawls' thought experiment of the veil of ignorance and the choice of principles to be made from behind it, Rand says, I submit that it is impossible for men to make any choice on the basis of ignorance, that is, using ignorance as a criterion. If men do not know their own identities, they will not be able to grasp such things as principles to live by, alternative, or what is a good, bad, or worst possible outcome. With Rawls clearly in mind, Rand has this to say about obscurity in writing. If you want to propagate an outrageously evil idea, your conclusion must be brazenly clear, but your proof unintelligible. Your proof must be so tangled a mess that it will paralyze a reader's critical faculty. A mess of evasions, equivocations, obfuscations, circumlocutions, non sequiturs, endless sentences leading nowhere, irrelevant side issues, clauses, subclauses, and sub-subclauses, a meticulously lengthy proving of the obvious, and big chunks of the arbitrary thrown in as self-evident, erudite reference to the sciences, to pseudosciences, to the never-to-be sciences, to the untraceable and the unprovable, all of it resting on a zero, the absence of definitions. What is Rand's political philosophy? Well, putting it as briefly as possible, I would have to say that as a political theorist, Rand is essentially a minarchist, that is, a minimal government libertarian. Libertarian because of the obvious emphasis she places on the importance of human liberty for an adequate human life, and minarchist because she believes that the basic condition that will permit men to associate together needs to be framed by a unitary code of law administered by a unitary enforcement body, and this for her is the state. It is important to note that Rand rejected the description of herself as a libertarian, largely because she identified libertarianism with anarchism. But not all libertarians are anarchists. Some, such as Murray Rothbard, are. Others, such as Tibor Machin, are not. Individuals have the right to defend themselves against aggression. But the use of physical force, even its retaliatory force, cannot be left at the discretion of individual citizens, thinks Rand. But why not? Because, she thinks, it would threaten the peaceful coexistence of all. Imagine what would happen, she muses, if someone had his wallet stolen and broke into every house in the neighbourhood to search for it and shot the first man who gave him a dirty look, taking the look to be proof of guilt. Indeed. Rand's example, lurid and tendentious as it may be, illustrates the dangers of self-help remedies against aggression. A tendency to shoot first and ask questions later, allied to yet another tendency to raise the violence stakes, seeking 2 eyes for an eye and 2 teeth for a tooth. Traditional societies that had no official organizations dedicated to preventing and investigating crime tended to repress the use of self-help remedies against criminal acts, except in cases of emergency, and to recommend instead having recourse to the appropriate socially sanctioned methods of adjudication and punishment. Order for Rand requires law, and that law must be objective, and it must be objectively enforced by an institution, one institution, charged with protecting rights. The function of government is limited to protecting individuals against the criminal invasion of their persons or property by other individuals or organizations. There is then, and there can only be, one system of law and one system of law adjudication and one system of law enforcement. In her essay on the nature of government, Rand defines government as, quote, an institution that holds the exclusive power to enforce certain rules of social conduct in a given geographical area, and as the means of placing the retaliatory use of physical force under objective control. This is more or less standard Weberian conception of the state and uncontroversial. But there are people, anarchists, who wonder whether government as such is evil by nature and whether anarchy is the ideal social system, writes Rand. These people, she thinks, confuse the inadequacies and evils of particular governments with the nature of government as such. Without government, society would be at the mercy of criminals. But, it might be asked, could we not have multiple governments competing with each other for business? After all, competition is generally good for keeping businesses honest, including businesses that provide services. So, why shouldn't the services of policing, security and courts be provided by multiple suppliers as well? Wouldn't the provision of these services in this way be less expensive and more efficient than its provision by monopoly? And more importantly, wouldn't it be voluntary? Rand's response to this suggestion is swift and scathing. Suppose, she asks, Mr. Smith, a customer of Government A, suspects that his next-door neighbour, Mr. Jones, a customer of Government B, has robbed him. A squad of Police A proceeds to Mr. Jones' house and is met at the door by a squad of Police B, who declare that they do not accept the validity of Mr. Smith's complaint and do not recognise the authority of Government A. What happens then? You take it from there, says Rand. I suspect we are supposed to imagine scenes of carnage as competing defence agencies fight it out like rival bootlicking gangs in 1920s Chicago. But why should it do so? Right now we have competing defence agencies, that is governments, all around the world, and they manage to get along with each other, at least most of the time. It's even possible for people living in different jurisdictions to sue and be sued. And even within the USA, there are multiple states and multiple police services operating at different levels, yet somehow managing to cooperate rather than engage in physical attrition. More locally, we have multiple insurance agencies supplying insurance services for people who are intermingled with each other, and yet they too manage to deal with one another without employing violence. Rand rejects anarchism, which she sees as undermining the stable structure of law and law enforcement that men living together require if they are not to become involved in endlessly escalating interpersonal violence. In this, her reasoning is very similar to Locke's portrayal of the inconveniences of the state of nature. If anarchy necessarily involved either no legal system or a chaos of competing and irreconcilable legal systems, then it would be hard not to agree with Rand on the necessity for a minimal government. But anarchism, at least libertarian anarchism, is not opposed to law, nor to a convergence of laws, nor to an enforcement of laws. Still less is it a supporter of chaos. Rand believed that libertarians were essentially subjectivists in ethical matters. Ronald Merrill expresses her reservations in this way. The key problem, he says, with libertarianism is its aversion to grounding political principles in moral philosophy. This negative judgment of libertarians would appear to derive from Rand's inability or unwillingness to distinguish between some and all, between what is incidental to libertarianism and what is necessary. But to reject government is not to reject law and order. To reject a monopoly supplier of justice is not to reject justice, any more than to reject a monopoly supplier of apples requires one to give up munching Granny Smiths. Again, Rand seems to think that libertarians are substantively committed to various let-it-all-hang-loose doctrines. He fails to appreciate the difference between, on the one hand, denying that laws can properly be used to enforce certain policies that infringe human freedom, and, on the other hand, commending certain uses of freedom. It is perfectly consistent, for example, to deny that it is a function of government to make and enforce laws concerning drug use without being committed to the view that drug use is a good thing. It is perfectly possible to be a libertarian and to hold socially conservative views on the necessity for a flourishing society to have and to embody restrictions. Rand's criticism of the various forms of tribalism is sharp and unanswerable. However, she characterizes libertarianism as a form of rightist tribalism. There are, she says, tribalists who claim to be rightists. They are champions of individualism, they claim, which they define as the right to form one's own gang and use physical force against others. And they intend to preserve capitalism, they claim, by replacing it with anarchism, establishing private or competing governments, that is, tribal rule. The common denominator of such individualists is the desire to escape from objectivity. Well, since Rand doesn't name names, it is difficult to know who exactly she has in mind here. Certainly, there are people who reject any notion of objectivity, and some of them would claim to be anarchists. It doesn't follow from this, however, that all anarchists reject the notion of objectivity. Nor does the anarchist notion of competing defense agencies amount to the reintroduction of tribalism. Rand distinguishes between a tribe and an association, the latter being ruled by ideas and not men. She writes, "All proper associations are formed or joined by individual choice and unconscious intellectual grounds, philosophical, political, or professional, not by the physiological or geographical accident of birth, and not on the ground of tradition." Ironically, this is precisely the basis upon which libertarian anarchism works. So, on Rand's definition, there is no way that anarchist groups can be said to be tribes. Let's line up the points of agreement and disagreement between Rand and libertarian anarchists. Libertarians, like Rand, accept the legitimacy of the use of retaliatory force. Libertarians, at least natural law libertarians, accept the necessity for objective laws, and so does Rand. In agreement with Rand, libertarians believe that laws, not necessarily legislation, should be enforced. The only significant point on which libertarians and Rand differ is that libertarians believe that retaliatory force, objective laws, and their enforcement can best be provided by multiple providers relating to one another more or less as insurance companies do at present. Apart from her misdirected critique of libertarianism generally, and libertarian anarchism in particular, how does Rand positively justify government? There doesn't seem to be an answer to this question, except to repeat that she believes that the provision of law and its enforcement can be provided only by a monopoly provider. Without such a monopoly provider, she seems to believe that there can be no objective law, no objective rules of evidence, and no objective control over the use of retaliatory force. What is missing, admits Roland Merrill, and it is a crucial admission, in the objectivist politics is a positive theory of the origin of government. What is government? What justifies it? Why should rational men submit to it? How does it or should it originate? Where does a Randian government get this authority from? Does it derive it from the consent of all the governed, or is it simply the case that the government mysteriously manifests itself and, once in place, simply repels all other contenders? If the source of a government's authority is the consent of the governed, how is this consent to be elicited? It seems that Rand has no answer to this simple and obvious question. Roland Merrill bluntly says, Rand simply dodges the issue. Where will Rand's minimal government get its money from? She accepts that taxation involves the initiation of force, and so is on her own principles impermissible. So government financing, and the government must be financed somehow, must be voluntary. Our concrete suggestion is a stamp tax on contracts. But since the government is a monopoly provider and customers are not free to go elsewhere, how would the imposition of such a tax not amount to the initiation of force, since the government monopoly can only be maintained by force? Rand appears to dodge several questions concerning the financing of other government services, police, military, and so on. And answers to these problems, it turns out, are for the future, she thinks. She writes, the question of how to implement the principle of voluntary government financing, how to determine the best means of applying it in practice, is a very complex one and belongs to the field of the philosophy of law. The task of political philosophy is only to demonstrate the nature of the principle and to demonstrate that it is practicable. Well, actually, it's not that complex a question, and it doesn't belong to the field of the philosophy of law, and even if it did, it would need some kind of answer. Roland Merrill is extremely charitable to Rand when he says that she was not primarily a political philosopher, interested in working out all the details. But this won't do. Rand is not being asked to work out all the details. She is being asked to answer some pretty basic questions in this area, and she appears to have no answers except to kick the question into the long grass. In the end, Merrill admits what by now should be obvious, namely that objectivist political theory is vulnerable to the anarcho-libertarian critique because Rand's work in this area failed to delve to the roots of the subject and deal with the inherent weakness of Locke's concept of government. Summary. Ayn Rand is perhaps more influential today than she has ever been. Rand's fiction is the key to her widespread popularity. Rand's ideas are a combination of classical and modern themes. Her basic philosophical orientation is Aristotelian, her political stance classical liberal, both entering into an uneasy alliance with a strain of ethical egoism. For Rand, rights are not entitlements to things, but rather the freedom to act. Rand's society is composed of individuals who each have rights to life, liberty, and property, which each must respect. As a political theorist, Rand is essentially a minarchist, minimal government libertarian. Libertarian because of the obvious emphasis she places on the importance of human liberty for an adequate human life, and minarchist because she believes that the basic condition that will permit men to associate together needs to be framed by a unitary code of law administered by a unitary enforcement body, and this, for her, is the state. While individuals have the right to defend themselves against aggression, the use of physical force cannot be left at the discretion of individual citizens. Order for Rand requires law, and that law must be objective, and it must be objectively enforced by an institution, one institution, charged with protecting rights. The function of government is limited to protecting individuals against the criminal invasion of their persons or property by other individuals or organizations. Rand rejects anarchism, which she sees as undermining the stable structure of law and law enforcement that men living together require if they are not to become involved in endlessly escalating interpersonal violence. Libertarians, as does Rand, accept the legitimacy of the use of retaliatory force. Libertarians, at least natural law libertarians, accept the necessity for objective laws, and so does Rand. In agreement with Rand, libertarians believe that laws, not necessarily legislation, should be enforced. The only significant point on which libertarians and Rand differ is that libertarians believe that retaliatory force, objective laws, and their enforcement can best be provided by multiple providers relating to one another, more or less as insurance companies do at present. How does Rand positively justify government? There doesn't seem to be an answer to this question, except to repeat that she believes that the provision of law and its enforcement can be provided only by a monopoly provider. Where does the Randian government get its authority from? It seems that Rand has no answer to this simple and obvious question.